Figure 16.3, Rethrowing an Exception. In this example, we're going to demonstrate the mechanics of catching an exception and throwing it again for further processing. This is the type of thing that you might do, for example, if you're writing a class library and as part of your class library you use another class library such as the C++ standard library, and one of the functions you call throws an exception. You might catch that exception, do a little bit of processing, and then throw it again to your client code so that they in turn can see that a problem occurred. A common occurrence of something like this is when a program is accessing a database and something goes wrong in accessing the database indicates a problem to the program or to the class library, and then the class library indicates a problem to the client code program. So that's a kind of a common scenario. Now in this case, I said we're going to look at the mechanics of how this works, and to do so we're going to start with our main function, and inside of main you see that we have a try block to indicate that a problem might occur in this code. Within the try block, we initially print out that main invokes function throw exception, which you can probably guess what that function is going to do, and then we call throw exception. Now I'll stop there for a moment and just show you main invokes function throw exception got printed. Then we go to that function, and you can see in that function that we are saying there's another try block, which means another problem might occur. And here, for mechanical purposes and pedagogical purposes, we output that function throw exception throws an exception, and we explicitly placed a throw statement here in the try block. Now normally you don't put throw statements in try blocks, but we wanted to force an exception to occur so that we could then catch it and show you the concept of rethrowing an exception. So normally line 17 wouldn't say throw on it, it would be a function call that in turn might throw an exception. Now in this case we're using the standard library class exception from the C++ exception header file, and we're just creating a default exception object. Then as soon as the throw statement occurs, anytime an exception occurs inside of a try block, the try block terminates immediately and you jump to the first catch following the try block. Now the type that was thrown is exception, the type being caught is exception, and notice in this case we didn't supply a parameter name. If you have no intention of interacting with the exception object that you receive as a parameter, then you don't have to specify a parameter name, and that's the case here. So when we catch this exception, to prove that it was caught, we will print out exception handled in function throw exception, and then we'll print out function throw exception rethrows the exception. So if I stop there, you can see those two lines of output. Now here is the syntax for rethrowing, and basically when you execute a throw of any kind from a catch handler, you will not successfully reach the closing curly brace of that catch handler, which means that you're not done processing the exception yet. Remember when we took a look at the first example that we said if you successfully reach the closing curly brace of the catch, that means the exception has been handled. So I like to say at line 23 here that I still have a so-called live exception, an exception that I'm not quite done processing, and when I say throw, it takes the exact same exception that was caught and throws it again to the next outer catch block, and the next outer try block, I should say. Now in this case there is no outer try block that's wrapped around this chunk of code. The outer try block is actually in the prior method main where the function throw exception was called. So if this block of code that I just highlighted, the try catch sequence, were contained in another try statement, then we have an opportunity to pass the exception back to the outer try statement. If there is no such thing in the scope that we're currently looking at, then the method will terminate. So at line 23 is where throw exception will terminate. There is no way in this example we can get to line 26, and if you look at the output you can see it doesn't say anywhere this also should not print. So we throw the exception out of this function back to where the function was called. Because that line of code is inside of a try block, the try block terminates at line 35, and we skip line 36, and you can see it doesn't say this should not print here. and then we catch the exception at line 38 because again we have a catch handler with the same type of exception that was thrown. And by the way, the same type is really an is-a relationship. You can have the exact same type here or a base class of the type of exception that was thrown, and in both cases it will catch the exception. Now once we catch it here, we print out that the exception was handled in main, which gives us this line of output, and then we continue with the next valid statement after the try-catch sequence, which indicates that program control continues after the catch in main, and you can see indeed that that line of code was displayed. So again, we're looking at the mechanics of the rethrowing of an exception. Basically, the idea is that you catch an exception, you maybe partially deal with it, possibly logging an error message to a file, for example. Then you throw the exception again so that the client code that called your function can in turn do additional handling if necessary.